All right, crack one, pull up the seat. Because we're going to talk about wings and weights today. And I'm not talking about the lunch special over at B-Dubs and Hitting Planet Fitness. No, I'm talking about ballast and aerodynamics. Or aerodynamics and ballast. Whatever. Here we go. First of all, let me preface all this by saying that I am not a chassis expert in any way, shape, or form. I'm just some guy who really loves drag racing and cars in general. But I've made a few observations recently, and I think a lot of you guys have seen the same things. And I just kind of wanted to come together and put a video together and discuss the how and the why all this crazy contraptions that we've been seeing in racing popping up in the recent years. And it's not really necessarily anything new. It's just implementation of different strategies in different types of drag racing. So most of the stuff we're going to talk about today is in regards to what I've seen in the no prep side of things, front side and or back side, and well, the street stuff too, because it all kind of parallels each other on that side of drag racing. So first of all, what is ballast? So ballast is technically defined as something heavy that stabilizes, in a nutshell. They use, sand or water or whatever on ships to create ballast. So the bottom is the center of gravity and the ship doesn't try to turn upside down when you put a bunch of crap on top of it. And in the race car world, ballast is used to do a number of things. Keep the front end down if you're on a really high tacky prep surface. Put more weight over the back end to increase traction. And in some cases, it's to meet the minimum weight. But if you have a car that's lighter than your class's minimum weight, well then you have the ability to put that ballast wherever you need to maximize its utilization within the chassis. To the casual observer in drag racing, they may think that a drag race is a one-dimensional race. You're on a flat surface and you go A to B, but it's not really that simple. In their eyes, they would think, if I want to keep the front end of the car down, I just move the weight towards the front. If I want to put the tire on the ground in the back and I want to jam it in as hard as I can, well, just move the weight to the back. And they think that there's no difference between the heights. Now, I'm here to tell you, if you paid attention to physics class, there is a tremendous variance between the heights of where you mount that ballast and its effect on the car's chassis, which is why we see these crazy contraptions coming out of the woodwork in recent years. And I think probably the most notorious is this guy, Joey Heupel, aka Beater Bomb, with his Mustang that's been dominating the streets and no prep events for absolutely ever. And recently he came out with what became affectionately known as the Butthurt Bar. I'm sure a lot of you watching this have seen this if you've even been in the drag racing or street racing or whatever scene for 5 minutes. When this car came out with this setup on it a couple years ago, kind of broke the internet. And a lot of people were like, that's the dumbest thing I've ever seen. It's ugly. It won't ever work. Well, he went to the finals, I believe, on the first time he came out with the thing. And very, very quickly, a lot of sanctioning bodies and promoters banned it. No butthurt bars, no external weights, etc., etc. Why is it designed the way it is? Well, it's pretty simple. It's all about leverage. So the bar hangs off the back. And if I put the weight further back, it has more leverage to work on the pivot point. And in that case, the pivot point is the rear end. Check this out. Okay, so to demonstrate everything we talked about with regards to weight and wings, I have our, let's call it the Beater Bomb 1/10 scale set up here. This is just a little no prep dragster that I have. And then I have my lovely one-armed assistant over here. What? What do you want me to call you?
Your daughter.
This is Maya, my daughter. And this is our weight, and we're going to use this weight to demonstrate what happens when you put weight and or forces on your chassis. So we have a scale underneath here. I put a rocker stand to attach the two rear tires together. And then up front here, the chassis is just elevated just to level everything out. So we've zeroed it out. This is our car sitting static on the starting line and no added ballast at all. But let's say we went out and we made a hit and we spun, and now we need to add some weight to it. So we're gonna put the weight in the trunk of the car directly over the back tires as best we can. And let's see, we've added 65 grams of weight. Don't ask why my scale is in grams, it's none of your business. So 65 grams of force being applied into the tire. with pretty much no compromise other than you have to carry that extra weight down the track. Maybe we want to add more weight, or we've opened up the rule set. Now we can run our butt hurt bar. Let's see what happens when we take those 65 grams of force and move it further back. We're not actually carrying any more mass, but this is going to affect the amount of weight. So now we're at 94. So 94 grams of force being applied to the tire with no extra weight being carried down the track. And then if we go in the extreme circumstance and run this thing all the way out the back, now we went from 66 to 90 something to 119 grams of force being applied to the rear tire. We're not carrying it down the track. Pretty sick, huh? Ow! Ah! Okay, so editing the video, I realized that I can't show you guys, and I didn't show you guys, what this car does dynamically, i.e. going down the track. I can only show you what it's doing statically by showing you the numbers that the scales are spitting out by the forces being applied to the rear tires. Now, what we just saw was the length, but what about the height? I keep talking about the height. Well, don't think about length as just length and then height. Think about length is the length of the lever, okay? It doesn't matter if it's like this, or like this. Now, the angle will change and dictate how much force is being applied statically, sitting still, but it won't really affect it dynamically, i.e. when it's going down the track. Now, the height, 100% will. 100 pounds vertically is 100 pounds vertically. It doesn't matter if it's 6 inches or 6 feet high. It's going to put 100 pounds of force on the tire as long as it is applied in the same point right directly above the tire. That's sitting still. But if I have 100 pounds, say 1 foot above the rear tire or 6 feet above the rear tire, that's going to be a drastic difference. Don't think of this as force being applied straight down, because that's not what we're talking about here. We're actually talking about torque. So this is a pry bar, and here's my pivot point. Pretend this is a big nut that we're trying to break loose, and we're applying torque on a torque wrench don't break bolts and nuts loose with a torque wrench. That's how you ruin your torque wrench. At least that's what somebody told me. If that's how you ruin a torque wrench, why do torque wrenches have reverse rotation? This is our breaker bar, and our job is to break this bolt loose or pick up the front of the car. Now, if I'm going to utilize this to apply the torque, I don't want to grab it way down here. I want to grab it way up here. So 100 pounds right here, 1 foot away, is going to apply 100 foot-pounds. 100 pounds 6 feet away at the end of our lever is going to apply, you guessed it, 600 foot-pounds of torque. These are all theoretical arbitrary numbers I'm just throwing out there, but the principle is the same as the length. So you see the difference, and if that makes sense. Because what we're basically trying to do, think of this as trying to pick up the front end of the car. And the easier it is to pick up the front of the car, well, the more force is being applied into the rear tire at the fulcrum, aka the pivot point. The other thing that I cannot demonstrate effectively here for you guys is what's going on with the suspension stuff. This is an independent rear suspension 1/10 scale RC car. This does not have the traditional link, leaf spring, 4-link, trailing arm suspension that you would see in most solid axle drag applications. So this thing is kind of useless for demonstration purposes. But the reason I want to talk about that is because that is basically how we are harnessing all these forces being applied to the chassis of the car. Because we're applying the weight, the force, the aerodynamic forces to the chassis of the car, not to the suspension. Yet. So whenever I push down on this, it's going to try to squat the suspension, right? Is it? So you would think. To the casual drag racing observer, you would think if I want to transfer as much weight as possible from the front to the back to maximize my traction, well, that's easy. Throw the front end up as high as you can, get the back end to squat. So the more extreme this angle is, the more weight is going to be applied to the rear tire. And that is true, statically, sitting still. But what happens dynamically going down the track? Well, if you look at new radial cars in the past 10 years of drag racing, you start to see these insane amounts of rear separation. The cars look like a bulldozer just plowing down the track. The reason for that is twofold. Number one, those cars are extremely light and they're going extremely fast. And a lot of the times that is to keep the front end down. They try and shape the car like a wedge to keep air from getting underneath, and it pushes on the whole body. So now the whole body of the car has become a wing. And then on the back of the car, they utilize the suspension geometry to the rotational force of the rear axle to drive the chassis up, utilizing the links of I'm trying to make my finger act like a 4-link bar, to drive the back of the chassis up. As the axle tries to rotate, it pushes the force into the chassis. And depending on where that link bar, the angle of it is, where it mounts on the chassis, determines whether it's going to try to lift the back of the car or try to lift the front of the car up and do a power wheelie. It's all in the angle of the dangle. And we measure that with what we call anti-squat. Again, I'm not a chassis guy. I'm not going to get into a whole bunch of the schools of thought on this. But if you still think that it's all about squatting the rear suspension as hard as you can, stuffing the tire up in the body to make it go fast, that's not how it always works. Especially in a radial application or small tire stuff when you don't have wheelie bars to control the height of the sidewall of the tire. So we utilize and harness the forces being applied to the chassis and then utilize the rear suspension geometry in order to apply those forces to the tire. Throughout this entire video, I have never once said squat, transfer weight. It's all about the end goal of driving the tire into the ground to maximize the amount of traction that we can have. Now let's talk about some people who have done just that in very creative ways. All right, so let's say you want your automotive cake and you want to eat it too. You want the traction without the trade-off. Unfortunately, as with most things in life, it's just not going to happen. There are compromises that are going to have to be made. But let's say, for the sake of conversation, you are limited to the confines of the body of the car. You cannot have external weights. There are sanctioning bodies out there that have this rule set in place, citing that it's ugly to look at. Well, looks don't win races, so who cares? But the other one is, which I tend to lean more towards, they're not safe. If you have 100, 200 pounds of weight hanging 4 to 5 feet off the back of a car, what is going to happen with that weight when something goes catastrophically wrong and the car ends up crashing? That weight can become a projectile very, very quickly. Everybody wants to have a souvenir when they take home from the track, but I don't think anybody wants to take it to the face at 100 miles an hour from 100 pounds. Imagine your obituary, like, Rya Klemp was tragically taken from us far too soon in a freak butthurt bar incident at the racetrack. I forgot to read that last part. Okay, so we don't want to take butthurt bars to the face. How do we get our traction? Well, you can go ahead and throw a whole bunch of weight in the trunk of the car. Some of the weight bias that you see out of these back of the track cars and the amount of weight that they're putting into the back of them to get that number on the scale that they're looking for is absolutely insane. And again, I would even argue downright dangerous, depending on how it's attached to the car in some circumstances. So we get into the aerodynamics package. Now, there are gains to be had by making the front end of a car more slippery, streamlined, directing the air where you want it to go. We're focusing on the back of the car, not the front in this video. So that's what we're going to talk about. But the same principles apply as they did when we talked about weight. The further back you put the wing and higher up, the more leverage it's going to have to act on the back. But why don't we see that on a lot of these like street cars that most of us are used to? Most of those drag wings are very flat and super low profile, so they look like they wouldn't really be applying a whole lot of downforce. And they don't. But they do still apply some, because when you look at that wing, it has side plates or sill plates, and then it has a wicker bill on the back of it. I'm sure there's a lot of aerodynamicists or physicists that are screaming, losing their mind out there because I'm butchering the terminology of all these components, but I don't really give The side plates or spill plates, think of the wing on the back of a drag car. It doesn't have a whole bunch of angle of attack, and those little tiny lips are basically straight up and down, so what are they even doing there? Well, think of it like a bathtub with 3 sides, and you have a bunch of water rushing over, and you want to catch water in that bathtub to apply just a little tiny bit of downforce. Or maybe, if you want to apply a lot, well then, you want to catch more water. You make your bathtub taller. So that's why you look at cars like Funny Car, Pro Mod. They have these big, exaggerated rear quarters because that's part of the aerodynamics. And those side plates aren't just to keep the air going straight, they're to hold the aerodynamic water in our aerodynamic bathtub and apply force to the chassis and smash the car into the ground. With these street cars, we don't have a lot of that side plate because we don't need a whole bunch of downforce because, honestly, these cars aren't really limited for traction. They're looking for some stability on the big end. A car like this Camaro right here, 1986, came with probably 200 horsepower from the factory, if I'm being generous. And it was probably tested aerodynamics wise to 85 miles an hour tops. Now, 2023, I could fart out a 4-digit horsepower combination with ease that'll punch this car deep into 8-second territory. We've doubled the mile per hour that this car is seeing from the factory configuration. And when you do stuff like that, weird shit can happen with air. It bundles up, it tumbles at the back of the car. We've seen people that throw the parachute and the parachute gets tangled up on something and they don't even have wheelie bars on the back. The parachute doesn't deploy. Whatever it is, it can create big problems. So not only do we need to accelerate down the track, we need to be able to slow down, and that is where stability is really, really imperative on these cars. So that's why our drag wings in most applications aren't crazy angles and stupid length or whatever, because we don't need the traction at 150 miles an hour, 160 and beyond. However, there are a couple other racers that do. No prep and top fuel and these big top alcohol dragsters. So that's why these wings are big, tall, crazy. They're high up, they're far back, making that pry bar longer to be able to pry down on the back of the car and apply force to the tire going down the track. But this one makes 10,000 horsepower, and this one over here makes 1,000, 2,000, if I'm being generous, on the no prep side. Well, they're fighting the same battle. 10,000 horsepower with a tire limitation and a traction limitation is not a whole lot different than 2,000 horsepower with a tire limitation and a traction limitation. They may be on extreme ends of the spectrum in drag racing as far as like capability goes, but the principles are the same. We want the wing high up, away from all the dirty air that's coming over the body of the car, so it gets its own clean air way up high. And also the angle of attack is kind of crazy when you look at it, because it has this huge pitch on the thing, big side place on there, and it's high up, far back to apply the leverage like a pry bar. Crazy, huh? But here's the difference between those two cars. A top fuel dragster, top alcohol, it doesn't have any rear suspension. So when you compress it, 100% of that force is transferred into the tires of the vehicle. But if we're talking about a street car or a chassis car, well, that has shocks. So what would happen if we mounted the wing directly to the axle? Okay, and let's talk about some of the more of the BMFs that utilize these principles and strategies to their advantage. And again, most of these guys are no prep racers because, well, that's where you're starting to see more and more of this stuff pop up. So right here let's talk about more of the wings and aerodynamics pieces. You're seeing a lot of these wings coming up because they're cheap and kind of easy to install. They don't add a whole bunch of weight to the car. And, on a no prep backside especially, the mile per hour is so low that there's not a whole lot of a downside for these guys. The drag that is being applied, they have horsepower on tap that they cannot utilize. So if they're paying the price by using 150 horsepower to push a spoiler through the air, but if that picks up 2-3 tenths on a backside or any no prep surface, well, that trade-off is well worth it. So you're seeing a lot of this stuff start to pop up, and a lot of those guys are making it into the winner's circle. Here you got a couple cars. One of them, the Mustang, the white one, belongs to a gentleman by the name of Andrew Lavender. Winning combination, small block Ford Mustang modular turbo deal, and it's not to be taken lightly on a no prep surface. Another version of this, as you can see on Nick Pluniak's car, this is his crazy rat rod, purpose-built no prep backside vehicle truck thing. It looks absolutely insane when you look at it, and you can see a lot of out-of-the-box thinking with this thing. On the back here, the wing looks absolutely insane, rivals the biggest sprint car wing, but it's mounted very far back and very high up in relation to the chassis, and it's up there in the clean air, and it probably puts a whole bunch of leverage on the backside of this vehicle, whatever you want to call it. And then continuing on, we also have Mr. Mike Gunter. This is what happens when worlds collide. Mike Gunter and this Fox body here, I like Mike's interpretation of a rule book quite a bit. I like people who push boundaries. So when they came out with the rule set that said no external weights, no butt hurt bars allowed, Mike said, cool. That is my new parachute mount. This is my new wing that I have to install with a cherry picker. So what looks like the Eiffel Tower and scaffolding turned sideways is actually an extended parachute wing or parachute mount, because nobody said how big your parachute mount has to be, what it's got to be constructed of, or length, width, height, whatever. So he said, cool, check this out. And then the other one over here is the wing, the notorious wing. And it may look absolutely ridiculous, but Mike has won some pretty substantial amounts of money with this combination. That is a cherry picker putting on a wing that is made entirely out of plate carbon steel. And I'm not giving away any crazy secrets here. Mike has talked about this before. And when I first met Mike at Rockingham Dragway and I saw the car, I was like, is this the notorious wing that everybody's been talking about? And he said, yup. And then he hopped up and sat on it. Try that with your flimsy carbon aluminum drag wing on a typical Fox body. If you're wondering why this wing is mounted on the back of the car with a whole bunch of steel tubing, well, it's not a lightweight. And it works. And the rule book says no external weights. It's not a weight. It's a wing. It doesn't say what my wing has to be made out of or how heavy it has to be. This is the drag racer mentality, ladies and gentlemen, is you look at the rule book and you just do what it says. It doesn't say you can't do. Read between the lines, right? And now, the grand finale. I love this one. All right, now, the last car we're going to talk about here is really the reason I made this whole video. This is a car called Houdini, owned by a gentleman by the name of Charles out of North Carolina. He has a couple other cars, Patches, which is a Fox body Mustang that's been notoriously strong on the no prep, as well as maybe even some of the Mexico side of the house. So he's no stranger to racing or the winner's circle for that matter. Even goes far back as one of the first guys to ever street race a Tesla and really hurt a lot of feelings with that car. Charles' new car here, Houdini, is very unique in my opinion. Pay attention to the wing. Its location is a little bit odd. The size and just, it's all weird when you really look at it. But then you kind of start to think, why is it located there? There's got to be a reason. That support goes directly through the back window and through the package tray. And it's also directly in line with the rear tires, which is where we want to put our weight and our force, right? Watch what happens when he bumps this car in. Did you see that? Watch it again. When he hits the bump button and the rear tire cracks, watch the spoiler or the wing. It moves independently of the body of the car. And when you see him launch the car, well, here's the trunk and the back window. You see the wing go bam, like that, and then take off down the track. That wing is attached directly to the rear axle. What? But why? Well, look at the Top Fuel car. They have no suspension. Dragsters have no suspension in the back. So all that weight, force, if you will, transferred from the downforce of the wing is channeled and pushed directly through the chassis, through the rear tires. There's no springs to compress. Like here, when you push the weight down on your bar, whether it's weight or aerodynamic force, then this is going to compress the spring to drive the tire into the track. Now, this is where I get a little twisted. If I took a spring that weighs 25 pounds and a weight that weighs 25 pounds, I set them side by side on a scale, the scale is going to read 50. If I took that spring and I set the weight on top of it, guess what? The scale is still going to read 50 pounds. But there's no give, there's no oscillation in that force other than the tire going over the racing surface when it's attached directly to the chassis. Now, like I said, Charles is not the first person to ever do this. He might be one of the first people to try it in no prep. I could even be wrong there. Even outside of drag racing, it's been done before. This is a picture of an experimental of F1 car where it has a wing on the front and the rear uprights or the spindles to apply the force directly to the tires. What F1 had found in testing, I did a little bit of homework on this for this video, was that the forces are channeled directly through those uprights attaching the wing. Now, on a endurance race application, that's a big issue because look at how we mount the wings in a drag car. There's these spindly little, tiny little strut rods, or, you know, when you get into these big crazy ones, it's a little bit taller and a little bit, but it's still not that sturdy and strong. So when you're going down the track and you hit a bump and that hits the tire and all that force gets transitioned into the object that's trying to smash the tire into the ground, and there's no give, no shock absorber, no coil, well, then it's going to get translated directly through the chassis, and you can end up with, maybe some failures or something like that. There may be something to that there, but I don't think that's an issue with this because we're not putting that much downforce down in an application like this. So how do you measure its effectiveness? Well, he won that race, but there was some controversy around that particular race that we just watched against Beer Money, Lyle Barnett in the other lane, because admittedly Charles guessed on the light because Beer Money's a very fast car, and he wanted every advantage that he could get. So in that case, he was probably more lucky than good, but I believe that car has gone on to win races. But again, it's not like he's coming out of nowhere crushing everybody's hopes and dreams with this new car. He is no stranger. He knows what it takes to win. So does it work? Like, the idea seems there, and I love innovation. I would love to see where this goes. On Charles's car, though, that wing is directly above, so it feels like it's pushing directly down on the rear axle. But what if you built a pickup truck with no bed floor, where I can mount the rear axle directly to the scaffolding, and I can put my wing way up high, way out back, mounted directly to the rear axle, where it doesn't just act like force. Now we're acting like a pry bar and utilizing the suspension to tweak, and our instant center gets crazy going down the track. And if you don't know what instant center is, that's a whole other video right there. But there's a lot, I think, that could be explored with the leverage of aerodynamics and the placement. And I am really excited to see how this all plays out. That's it. Anyway, let me know in the comments what you think. Do you like these tech videos or not? Is this too long, nauseating? Maybe you learned something, maybe you didn't. I don't know. I thought it was really cool. Compile some information, show you guys some stuff. And if you did like this video, like, comment, subscribe. Helps us out a ton. We're going to try to be better about this and push out a lot more content. And I'm just trying to come up with cool, fun ways to talk about stuff rather than watching me turn wrenches on cars all day long. Although these are some pretty cool cars to turn wrenches on. All right, that's it. I'm out. Peace.